125, 130. Okay, we'll start. And I know someone else has came in. Other people can come in. Okay, welcome everybody to the webinar. My name's Matthew Restall. As you can see, I'm in the history department at Penn State, and I'm the founder and editor of Latin American Originals. So the series is my baby, and I'm very proud of it. And the 16 previous published volumes that is now brought up to 19 with these 3 new ones. This is the biggest bumper crop of LA books ever harvested. I don't think I remember us having even 2 come out at the same time, let alone 3. So this is a particularly proud day for me. And I'm grateful to our 3 authors for the tremendous amount of work that they've put into creating these 3 fantastic additions to the series. Before I introduce them, let me just thank Ellie Goodman, who is executive editor of Penn State Press, and she contributes a great deal of work to the series and every volume in it, and I'm grateful to her. And also to Kate Frick for organizing this webinar. She's sort of secretly invisible behind the scenes, actually made the whole thing possible and will save us if we run into some kind of tech disaster. The 3 authors here, as you can see in alphabetical order, are Peter Hess, who is author of Violent First Contact in Venezuela, Nikolaus Federmann's Indian History. We have Kris Lane with us, who is author of Pandemic in Potosí, Fear, Loathing, and Public Piety in a Colonial Mining Metropolis, and Andrea Martínez Baracs, author of An Irish Rebel in New Spain, The Tumultuous Life and Tragic Death of William Lamport. And I'm going to introduce each author in slightly more detail now, and then ask each of them in turn to tell us a little bit about their book. And then we'll open it up for discussion. After all 3 of their presentations, we'll open it up for discussion, and they'll be taking your questions. You can submit a question via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And if your question is for a specific author, then please note that, and we'll do our best to get to as many of your questions as we can. So now I turn in more detail to Peter Hess. Again, we're going to go in the alphabetical order of the authors. So Peter Hess is Associate Professor of Germanic Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. And as a scholar of early modern German literature and culture, Peter adds to the disciplinary and linguistic diversity of the series in important and fascinating ways. In addition to Violent First Contact in Venezuela that he's about to tell us about, he's also author of Resisting Pluralization and Globalization in German Culture, 1490 to 1540, Visions of a Nation in Decline. I now turn it over to you, Peter.
How to unmute. Thanks, Matthew, for your kind introduction. Yeah, let me turn on my PowerPoint, and if it doesn't work, please let me know. I just had it up a second ago. Huh. It just went away. That's crazy. I'm sorry about that. I had it just lined up, and now it's it closed apparently. Anyway, let me. Sorry about this little problem. Okay, I'm back here. There it is. Can you see now? Yeah, okay. My apologies.
Yes, working now.
Great. My apologies for this delay. I just had it lined up, but it's not working. Anyway, so that's my book, and what's maybe unusual about this book, it's a single text, whereas all the other volumes of Latin American originals have had, multiple texts. This is just one text, and I want to talk to you about that for a second. The context is a very interesting and unique event in colonial history. in Latin America, namely the fact that a German merchant company received a contract to colonize part of the colonial empire in Latin America, namely what is today roughly Venezuela. The Welsers were a wealthy merchant company based in Augsburg, Germany, and they established trade offices in Seville and Santo Domingo in 1525 and 26, and had this contract with the Spanish crown in 28. They abandoned the project in 1546 and never could make it work completely. It would go too far to get into that now, but maybe we can discuss that in the discussion. So what did the Welsers want out of this adventure to set up a colony in Venezuela? Setting up mining operations, setting up plantations, setting up a trade network, and also perhaps finding a navigable passage to the Pacific Ocean that would have opened up tremendous trade opportunities. Nikolaus Federmann, our author, was hired as a military commander by the Welsers and sent to Venezuela in that role. We know very little about him and his history and his biography. We know he's born in 1506 in Ulm in southern Germany. He arrived in Venezuela in 1529, stayed till 32 on his first journey, and he essentially entered the interior of Venezuela with a bunch of mercenary in 1530-31. That's the essential topic of the book. He was banned from Venezuela in December 1531 because of insubordination, returned to Augsburg, returned in 1533, had a second journey to Venezuela, and is considered one of the co-founders of Bogota in 1539. However, he arrived about a month after Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada, which is why the main avenue in Bogota is named after him. It's not called Avenida Federmann. That he's disputed who gets the claim to Cundinamarca, the province around Bogota. They all went to Spain to settle the claim, and ultimately Jimenez de Quesada won out, and the Welsers and Federmann lost. The Welsers then accused him of embezzlement and breach of contract. The Spanish thought he was a Lutheran, and he ended up dying in jail in Valladolid under very uncertain circumstances in February 1542. What motivated Fiermann? Plundering gold. The text says that very clearly. Gaining control of land for himself, adventure, and he was obsessed with the idea of finding the South Sea, as he calls it, the Pacific. Federmann and other Welser operatives were not incentivized to implement Welser long-term plans, so nobody's talking about mining among any of the conquistadors in the services of the Welsers. Very briefly, a map here. Fiermann first arrived in Santo Domingo, as everybody did who had anything to do with the conquest up until the 1530s. And from there, he sailed down to Santa Ana de Coro. Coro was then the colonial headquarters of the emerging colony. This is one of the Welser galleons, so the Welser company actually owned their own ships. They also used them to do, originally used them to go on the Portuguese route. This is the map of the incursion that text talks about that lasted from 12 September 1530 to 17 March 1531. That's actually the map that's in the book. It leads from Coro inland and to the Orinoco Basin, and essentially back to not an authorized incursion, which has is an interesting aspect of this. He started out with 126 mercenaries, 16 on horseback, and about 100 native carriers. The number of native carriers varied greatly throughout the incursion as people absconded and others were forced into service. They traveled about 270 Spanish miles, or about 1,145 kilometers. So it's quite a distance for half a year. This is a topographic map to see what the obstacles were. Initially, that's the yellow route from out of Coral. Initially, they traveled through mountainous terrain and then entered into the Orinoco Basin, which was a swampy, impenetrable terrain, full of dangers, full of disease, full of swampy terrains. And then they moved back along the coast because they were too tired and too worn out to take the same route through the mountains. The text itself was written in 1532 for 33. The publication history is very, very uncertain. Let me just move on, please. We don't go over time here. Here is the text itself that I used to translate. This is the copy at the Herzog August Bibliothek in Wolfenbüttel. There's only one of maybe 4 copies that are still excellent. Here is just an open copy as I was sitting at a table, literally translating every day. So let me quickly talk about the purpose of the text. It was marketed to a German audience in 1557 as a beautiful and entertaining story, promising a pleasurable adventure text. My argument is that Fiermann set up his narrative as a probanza de merito, which is a report conquistadors had to submit to the Spanish crown, and this was, of course, established first by Columbus, then Cortés, and finally, starting 1524, it became kind of required activity. Federmann himself saw himself as a conquistador, as this quote shows. He sees himself as in a row with Hernán Cortés, Pedro Arias Dávila, and interestingly, Hernando Colón, which of course was the second son of Christopher Columbus. That was a little mix-up here on his part, but he clearly sees himself in that row, in that legacy, so to speak. Very briefly, what comes up often is the logic of the requerimento. Essentially, either submit to the Spanish rule or face essentially being punished. I'm not going to read that quote because I want to wrap it up in a couple of minutes. So his text is clearly a conquest document. It's not just a travel log. I would really like to stress that here. He describes the dynamic of violent first contact, discusses strategic considerations, describes extraordinary violence he extorted on the native population. Gifting, it plays a role, and of course, dissimulation on both sides. It's deceptive strategies of communication. Very brief, a big topic in research is why could somebody like Fiermann with 126 people prevail or at least come out alive, which is in a way is quite an accomplishment, if you will. Weapons play a role: the sword and the crossbow, horses, fighting dogs. That's a question mark. He mentioned dogs, although never in a fighting capacity. The element of surprise. Fiermann took advantage of this unity and strife among native nations. He was able to fight without regard for seasonality and agricultural manpower demands. He could rely on a mobile strike force, whereas the natives had to protect women, children, villages, harvests. And finally, the role of disease. Federmann noticed that some nations have been devastated by disease even before the Spaniards had gotten there. There are a number of violations of warfare. Let me skip this here and come to the last. What does the text tell us about Federmann's mind? To me, that's the most interesting part. So for several months, as I was working on this, Federmann kind of crept into my mind. I mean, it's hard not to start to think like him when you work in a text like that. Some passages read like an inner monologue, like he's talking to himself, explaining his reasoning, his deliberations, consequences of actions. He tried to control how his mercenaries might appear to his native adversaries. He tried to understand how his native to anticipate. And the one thing that really surprised me, there's a true expression of existential fear. Fear because of disease, fear because of difficult swampy terrain, and also fear of increasing hostile indigenous nations. So there are moments when he thought that he might not make it out alive. But that was really surprising to me to see that fear in his text and the possibility that they actually might perish. That's all I would like to add here. Maybe later some more in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Peter. Let me just reiterate to you, participants and attendees, do feel free to put into the Q&A box at the bottom your questions at any time, not the chat box in the Q&A box. You don't have to wait until everyone has finished speaking. Those will just queue up in there. And now it's my pleasure to move on to Kris Lane. Kris is the Franz V. Scholes Professor of History at Tulane University. He edits the Colonial Latin American Review, although not for much longer, and also book series with 2 university presses, neither of which are Penn State Press, and so therefore we will not mention what those presses are. He's the author of many books, all of which have helped in significant ways to shape the field of colonial Latin American history. In addition to Pandemic in Potosí that we're about to hear about, his books also include Potosí, the Silver City that Changed the World, and Pillaging the Empire, Global Piracy on the High Seas, 1500 to 1750, and Color of Paradise, The Emerald in the Age of Gunpowder Empires, and also Quito, 1599, City and Colony in Transition. Over to you, Kris.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you to all of the folks at Penn State who put this together. Penn State University Press has been really supportive, and it's hugely appreciate this opportunity to discuss these 3 sudden appearances, all Latin American originals. And it's a pleasure to be here and share the screen with Peter and Andrea as well. I want to mention that I lived in the Barrio Nikolaus Federmann in Bogota. So the story, I'm very excited to be reading this firsthand account that Peter has made available to us. And I've always been fascinated by this story also of William Lamport, because he's such an astonishing figure, a charlatan from the middle of the 17th century who seemed to be everyone and no one. So if you're not interested in pandemics and you're sick of what I'm writing about, the other 2 books will be great. Pandemic in Potosí was really a teaching module that I spent probably too much time developing because it became engrossing. Like many of you, the coronavirus pandemic suddenly made me have to think about what to do with the inability to travel to archives. And I realized there was a story hiding in plain sight. I'm going to share my screen just to show a couple of quick slides here. Let me know if that this pops up. Is that visible now? Yes, okay. I had been working with a text from the early 18th century, a history of the city of Potosí that traces its story from its discovery in 1545 until the death of the author in 1736. He literally fell over while writing. He was finishing up when death stilled his pen. And I realized that he had actually lived through this great disease epidemic. I'm calling it a pandemic because it was good alliteration with Potosí. It may not have been a global pandemic, but at least it swept through all of South America, or a big chunk of South America, between 1717 and about 1722. seems to have kind of died out by 1720, but there are still some mentions of people dying of something similar in 1722. So as we are witnessing with the coronavirus, it took at least 2 years for most places to get through this pandemic experience. And Arsans is the name of this author living in Potosí. He describes the arrival of a peste, what he kind of calls a plague, but he compares it with descriptions that he's familiar with of the bubonic plague in the mid 14th century in Europe. And he says, well, it's very similar, but it has significant differences. So it's definitely sent by God to punish us for our sins, but its symptoms, its signs and symptoms are distinct. And as I read his account, I realized there probably are other accounts. And sure enough, there's one from Cusco, which was also devastated. On the map on the right, Cusco is in the upper left, just east of Lima. And there's an account from Arequipa, also just south of Cusco. There are mentions of this disease epidemic in Huancavelica, Peru, in La Paz, Bolivia, in Arica, Chile, in Oruro, Bolivia, and La Plata, which is close to Potosí, really all the way down through Cordoba and Buenos Aires. And it was devastating. It killed at least a third of the population of all of these towns as it passed through. And in some cases, in the Cusco case, it seems it might have even been higher. It was a little over a third from what Arsans tells us about Potosí. But it's a story that is drawn from a Baroque point of view, a Baroque Roman Catholic point of view. It isn't a kind of objective description that you might expect from say, an 18th century writer. Arsans is very much a believer in providence. And he sees Potosí, on the left, you have his map of the world. He has Potosí as kind of the center of the world. It's a place where human action has global ramifications. And I've argued in another book that that's true in the sense that Potosí silver really did have a transformative effect. But for Arsans, he doesn't see Potosí as enriching the world in a positive way, but really corrupting it. And because Potosí is this place that is so important in God's great plan, it is the sins of the people of Potosí that bring on these punishments, these repeated punishments. And for him, then, the pandemic that sweeps through is intended to be a sign that all of us should repent and change our ways. And but he links it up kind of retrospectively with the appearance of comets, with monstrous births, with various other signs, the arrival of foreigners on the coast who might be heretics. There is in fact a German trader who arrives with slave traders from the English East, it's actually the English South Sea Company. And he is converted to Catholicism, and this is seen as a great thing, but his arrival is also quite a dangerous sign. So along with the comets, the foreigners, the birth of a two-headed child, all of these things lead Arsans to really lay out what his interpretation of this historical event is. And it's really about sin and charlatanism. Again, people who profess to have some cure for this thing, or that they have some explanation for it. And it shows also that people's belief in an emerging enlightened medicine, there is at this time a kind of shift in medical theory. It's still very unfamiliar to us, but it's a shift that's noticeable to historians of medicine, that that any of these types of human interventions are going to fall short. So the book really works through several different narratives. One is Arsans's narrative, that's the central one. Another one is by an author named Diego de Esquivel y Navia, and I call him Esquivel. Esquivel describes events in Cusco at about the same time. And a third author is named Ventura Trabada y Córdoba, from Arequipa, and I call him Travada, and that's how he's generally referred to by literary scholars. And you can compare these different narratives. Arsances is the most extensive and detailed, and he gives us a kind of blow-by-blow and a listing of all the processions. Essentially what people do in response to this disease is they go out into the city and parade their favorite saint. So their image of the Virgin of Copacabana, or their image of San Sebastian, or their image of San Roque, Saint Roque, who is the patron of plague. These are carried around, and everybody's, you know, packed in the streets like this. So it's not a time of great social distancing, but it is a time when the elites kind of close their doors and let the poor die in droves. So for Arsances, it reveals the limits of charity, the limits of people's Christian devotion, and he highlights the actions of priests who he thinks are acting very piously and correctly, even if it kills them. But most of them are spared, it seems. And this is something that, in the end, produces a kind of government reaction on the part of the emerging Bourbon state that is not good for the poor. It essentially raises the labor demands on indigenous people as their numbers have declined. So there are real consequences to this that go beyond a kind of a disaster capitalism sort of response that goes beyond what Arsances describes. And the second narrative of Cusco is interesting to compare because it's a little bit less providential. It's a little bit more dispassionate, you might say, but it hints at many of the same sins. And the account for Arequipa, which is much shorter, is even more fantastical than the one by Arsances. So a reminder that different people who witnessed this event as it blew through their city interpreted it in significantly different ways, even though they were writing at about the same time. And then the book has a few bits from individuals who were physicians or self-styled physicians who offered cures. And they described the symptoms so that we can at least imagine what exactly this thing was. And we still don't know. Very recently, a number of skeletons were discovered in the main square of Potosí, where one of the churches that Arsances describes was the main burial place for indigenous victims in the city. They were brought there by the hundreds. And there are people working on those skeletal remains now, and they may be able to recover some genetic material that would tell us what this particular disease was, or what the pathogen was. But in the meantime, we have these 18th century cures, and they give you a sense of the medical theories that were in the air at the time. And there's a lot of dispute there as well. So the reason that this book has multiple narratives kind of in contrast with one another is so that students and teachers can see that there's no consensus. There's actually a lot of dissent about what exactly caused this, what was to be done, what would work and what would not work when it came to medicine. But pretty much everybody agreed that it was human sin that brought it on, and that people were to blame for their bad behavior. So I'll stop with that and look forward to the question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kris. Wonderful. And now what a treat to also have Andrea Martínez Baracs with us. She's one of Mexico's leading historians, leading historians of any field of history, but especially the colonial period. She was for 2 decades a research professor at CIESAS, that's Mexico's Center for Advanced Studies in Social Anthropology. And she's now director of the Biblioteca Digital Mexicana. Check that out. In addition to an Irish rebel in New Spain, she's published numerous books, including no less than 7 books on the history of Tlaxcala. And you heard that right, 7 books. I'll give you the title of one, Un Gobierno de Indios Tlaxcala, 1519 to 1750. Forgive me rendering that book title in Spanglish. And then one more book title of hers I'll give you that will lead us to her LAO book, and that is Don Guillén de Lamport, Hijo de sus Hazañas. Over to you, Andrea.
Well, thank you, Matthew, very much. I am very proud and grateful to Penn State University Press and to the Latin American Original Series editor, Matthew Restall, to Ellie and all the staff for having published it. It was a very hard work because of the translation of difficult originals. And also I thank you for the lovely title, very 17th century, The Tumultuous Life and Tragic Death of William Lamport. I liked it very much. And I'm happy to share this crop of new books with Peter and Kris and with South America to go beyond only Mexican subjects. The book presents an appraisal of the life and work of William Lamport, born in 1611, died in 1659. He was an Irish rebel, a soldier, a poet, and a thinker who was burned at the stake by the Inquisition in Mexico, then New Spain, for fostering an uprising that would make him King of Mexico, restore the usurped privileges of the indigenous peoples, and give the African slaves and the persecuted Jews their freedom. The 17th century is for Mexico the lost century. 16th century, by contrast, was a time of the dramatic and spectacular Spanish conquest and takeover, and also of the philosophical and theological discussions about the right to dominate the known New World of that time. In the 17th century, the Spanish colonization was thriving. The church and the religious orders had settled in most of the now viceregal territories, and indigenous villages and economy were learning to live in their new harsh reality. The big discussions were a matter of the past. Around 1640, Europe and its colonies were experiencing dramatic upheavals. The uprising of Catalonia in 1638, the rebellion in Scotland, the fight against Charles I's absolutism in England, the Duke of Braganza leading Portugal to its independence from Spain, the Dutch trying to conquer the coast of Brazil, and finally the Irish uprising, 1640-1641. For Spain, the Portuguese were the great traitors, and many crypto-Jews, that is, forcefully converted Jews or marranos, suspected of keeping their religions, had fled Spain for Portugal in its previous independence before 1580, only to flee to the New World when the dynastic union was established in 1580 to 1640. Now they were labeled Portuguese, traitors suspected of intriguing to separate Mexico from Spain. It so happened that the crypto-Jews were also among the creators and main pillars of Spain's financial empire. So some reformist voices in Spain, first and foremost the Count Duke of Olivas, main advisor of King Philip IV, argued for their protection. In that year, 1640, there appeared in Mexico an Irish-Spanish man of 29, a loner quick to intervene in intrigue and conspiracies and to make dangerous connections. Some historians purport he was a spy for the Count Duke. He certainly had been already an Irish revolutionary, a soldier for the Catholic crown of Spain against the Protestants, and a truncated but bright academic. In Mexico, he sent to the court critical appraisals of the political situation and the alarming new trends of the Inquisition against the Jews. But mainly Lamport discovers in Mexico the Indians, dispossessed, their world and sovereignty lost, the African slaves and their descendants, and the crypto-Jews, with whom he will soon share an unexpected closeness, since they will end up in jail together for many years. Lamport picks up by himself the moral discussions of the precedent century, believes in the illegitimacy of the Spanish dominion of these lands, and so he decides to rise with the kingdom. He talks a humble blind miner whom he has helped in some legal dispute, into organizing a small army of Indians. His aim is to ignite a rebellion, obtain the independence of Mexico, become the king, and reign, given equal opportunities to Indians, Africans, and Spaniards. He is captured by the Holy Office, the Inquisition, in December 1642, and never recovers his freedom. This is my personage, William Lamport, or Lombardo, his Spanish name. Lamport's family were Old English Catholics who lost their land and their religious freedom after the English conquest of Ireland. His grandfather had been a soldier against the English. His persecuted father became a monk. Our William was a histrionic character who jumped on the top of the wave and didn't look back. His life appears as if it had been conjured by him, although his invention led to a tragic end. In jail for 17 years, he told his jailers again and again his aggrandized life story, interweaved with his theological, philosophical, and political auto-defense, and also made publicly, insistently, the defense of the Jews jailed with him. His dramatic destiny turned him also into a tragic but productive Catholic mystic, writing in his prison 918 psalms in Latin. Such is the story which appears now at the Penn State Latin American Originals, a very well thought editorial creation of which I am now a grateful author. The essay on his life and work discusses his insurrectional projects for Ireland and Mexico, and also covers his fear argumentations in his hearings depositions, where we can distinguish, beyond his courage and his intelligence, the workings of a mind of his time, elaborating anew for the benefit of his cause and that of the Jews imprisoned with him, on the modern idea of the human right of free thought against forced confessions, for no one has the right to probe the depths of the heart reserved for the scrutiny of God. That is to say that each person has a right to retain and protect their own secrets, and further that every person is innocent unless proven guilty with legitimate motives and methods. He also offers a kind of anthropological vision of Judaism to try and protect the crypto-Jews for being persecuted in the ground of their forbidden religion. This book offers also an anthology of his most representative writings, both political and literary, never before published in English, and most of them hardly known in their original language, Spanish or Latin. The detailed project for a Spanish-supported Irish insurrection, a long manifesto and plan for a Mexican uprising against Spain. His auto-defense, which he wrote in jail in many copies and nailed to the doors of the cathedral and other spots when he managed to briefly flee his prison in 1650. A selection of his poetry, both secular, mythological, and religious, and the accusation that led him to the pyre. Through all of this original material, one can follow the thinking of a 17th century enlightened Catholic man caught between the scholastic mind and the humanistic trends he had been exposed to in university and in his travels as a soldier in a Europe torn by intolerance and the religious wars. The general reader, scholar, student will receive through this book a general view of this personage of the early modern period, whose life spanned Ireland, Spain, and early Mexico, and whose written work conveys an original reflection on the system of justice and the situation of the Indians, the Blacks, and the Jews in 17th century Mexico. Okay.
Thank you so much, Andrea. We are now going to go to a Q&A. We have about 20 minutes time for that. And to you attendees, you can submit a question at any time in the Q&A box. Let me just stay now, and I'll repeat it again at the end, but in case you leave during the Q&A, you attendees will get a follow-up email with a discount code for 40% off the books. And let me also point out that in the chat feed, Kate has put links to each of the books so that you can more easily jump in there and check them out. While we don't have any questions in the Q&A box yet, so while I'm waiting to see if any of our participants and attendees are going to come up with some brilliant questions. I don't see the names of the participants, but I think I know who some of them are, and I have a feeling there are going to be some good questions any minute. And I also am pretty sure that there are at least 2 or 3 people who are prospective, possible future LA authors. So let me just begin the Q&A by asking a kind of a generic LAO question to all you 3 authors. People often ask me, how much work is it to do an LAO volume? And then the answers that I have got from the previous, I guess 19, was really more than 19 authors, because some of the books are co-authored, but range from, oh, it was such a lovely break from writing my monograph, it was much easier and less stressful, all the way through to people saying, yeah, you warned me it might take longer than I thought, and it took just as much work as writing a monograph. It really is a mini monograph with a translated text in it, which is, I think, is the strength of the books in this series. That's what they are. So you 3, at any, just put your hands up or whatever. What advice do you have for someone who's listening and watching and considering and wanting to be one of you?
I would say to take good notes and don't forget to put the quote properly, because you will pay it dearly, especially if it's a research that takes many years. You end up with a bunch of stuff, no? Order.
Yeah, I would like to add, I mean, I think it's important to have a real purpose in mind, a text that's really worthwhile being disseminated for students and for scholars, and then the work really can be quite intensive. In my case, this is a very difficult text to read, even though I'm used to reading 16th century German. This was a real challenge just because of the syntactic complexity. Federmann was not a great writer, so it's really hard to figure it out. So you have to sometimes bring a lot of patience and a lot of, you have to spend a lot of research. Sometimes I spent half a day just on one sentence. So you have to bring a lot of patience. It's tedious work, but it's also rewarding.
You have anything to add to that, Kris?
Yeah, I could just say that it's always more work than you think. It's a different format. And so I think it does exercise a different part of the brain. You have to translate, introduce the translation, annotate, but not overdo it. It's not, a massive compendium. You're not allowed to make it too long. And that's a special trick, I think. A special challenge.
Right. 45,000 words. Not a word over. We have another question that is for all 3 of you, which I like that, to kind of compare the answers. So this question is, what led each of you to research the topics that you wrote for each of your books? And that question says, thank you for all your wonderful presentations. That's a big question. You're going to have to see if you can answer that briefly, guys.
Well, I can start. I mean, it's sympathy, of course. It's personal history, and it's sympathy for some projects against others, and it's also chance for me. It's chance and biography. One thing leads to another. Like Tlaxcalan, we were with Matthew together with James Lockhart at his seminars and groups of studies and translation. So that led me to Tlaxcalan in the first place. But why was that? Because a friend of mine said, take that subject, the sources are wonderful, nobody has done it before you. I mean, they're basically untouched. So that was it, a sentence. So I think it happens. I mean, I'm not very systematic. Perhaps you, the co-panelists, are.
Yeah, I just might add, I've been interested in this text for over 10 years. I've actually taught versions of it in classes and found it utterly frustrating. There was not a single really reliable, readable text in any language. And the more I dealt with it, the more I understood how important the text really is, because it tells a chapter of the conquest that was really not told before, or not told in this way. So I decided to simply take on the project. I mean, so many colleagues, encouraged me, please do that. I'd be happy to use my class. So finally, decided to take it on, and have no regrets. I think it's been a great project. And thanks, Matthew, for including it.
Kris, before you answer, because I think I know your answer is going to be, well, I was already writing another book on Potosí, or something like that. So it might be short, but there's a specific question for you. So let me throw this in, so you've got two different things to answer at the same time. You mentioned that the dominant narrative about the cause of the pandemic was one of divine punishment. Was there any indication of people doubting this, or hints at other narratives in the documents that you read?
Oh, that's great. I was working on, and still am working on, another interminable project, as most of us are. And this seemed like a mercenary chance to jump into something a little bit different or switch gears. And it just so happened that it seemed relevant at the moment, that I thought, if almost exactly 300 years ago, 1719, a massive, world-altering disease epidemic flies through your region, I just wanted to see, what did people think of it? How did they react to it? I think because Arsance and the other writers that I've been able to trace were religious figures of some sort, or they were deeply religious themselves, they couldn't help but see this any other way. I think their sense that it was a divine punishment fit into a logic of human action. What really jumped out at me was that sense that the things that we do in our lifetime have not just, immediate consequences on our relationships with people around us, but they have cosmic consequences, and that we can actually bring down a punishment on everyone, not just on ourselves. And in fact, we might be spared, and that might be more of a punishment if our children died or something like that. So the sense of human agency that comes through in these texts is really, that stunned me. I kind of knew it, but I wasn't really ready for it, because with the current pandemic and the way that we were, being given advice on how to act, how to be responsible, it was all in the language of today's public health and today's understanding of medicine and disease, but very rarely put in the context of, your actions in your lifetime actually can have a huge impact beyond you. And that I hadn't heard that kind of language since the outbreak of AIDS, 25, 30 years ago. And so it kind of brought some things to the fore once again. But in terms of, I think, what does it all mean? Were there people who doubted? I just haven't found people who wrote something down that said otherwise, but I'm sure there were skeptics. An example of a little bit of skepticism or some difference was there was a comet, and some people said, well, the comet's related and it was a warning, and others said, no, that comet was not related. But as for our being responsible for this terrible thing, yes, we all agree on that.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to make a quick question on this subject to Kris. I'm remembering the scatological interpretations of the epidemics in the 16th century. And I'm feeling that it was like the same reaction, the same interpretation. And so I'm thinking of what Matthew was saying. Could something have been different? Because the mention of the comet, you would think of Sigüenza in Mexico, the beginnings of the science in Latin America, and these interpretations, perhaps they were trying to find concrete, the rational explanations for what was going on. Would you say there's an evolution? It's the same 16th to 18th century, almost to today?
That still, the language is a little bit different, of course. There's an accumulation. By the time Arsance is writing a history of his hometown that goes back to 1545. So this isn't the only time disease comes through. This is just the worst one. And he says, I happen to have lived through this one, and so I'm pretty sure I'm right that this was the worst one. But he mentions the Cocolitzli in Mexico. He mentions these other diseases that swept through the Andes in the 1580s. So he's not really innovating in terms of his understanding or his interpretation of these events, but he gets quite specific about what's going on in our age. So when he's kind of talking about modern times, circa 1720, 1730, and saying the things that we're doing now are testing God in a different way, or we're testing fate in a different way. So he does seem to think that there's more evil in the world and there's more lasciviousness. Essentially, it's decline. Things might have been bad in 1530, but they're worse now in 1720, whatever. And so I think in a way he's trying to tie in the significance of his hometown and to drive home the point to the people that live there. We have a responsibility. And that responsibility is so much bigger than us. We have a responsibility, if we're elites, of the kind of upper crust or the educated class or whatever, to take care of indigenous people, and that their suffering is what you see most clearly. And if you don't do something to alleviate it, then that's on us. So it is very much personalized and kind of thrown back onto elite Creoles, quite specifically.
Okay.
As you're talking, I'm remembering something that came up the other day when I was talking about Latin American originals volumes with people. There's a feature of all the books in the series that kind of surprised me when I realized it had emerged, and it's really particularly relevant to your three books. And that is that each book has a set of leading characters or protagonists, and often one particular protagonist. And then there's sort of a supporting cast. And of course, the books aren't conceived as biographies, right? I mean, the series isn't conceived like that, and nor are the books, but that's how they kind of emerge. And who those characters are and what they're like is a really, to me, a really kind of fascinating way of thinking about the sources, and also how you as scholars have packaged those sources in order to present them to people, right? I mean, Lamport is incredibly complex character. You can go through and read Andrea's book like over and over, and every time you'd think you've misunderstood him the last time you read it, and there's a different way to think of him. I mean, Federmann is like, he's also likewise, he's sort of fascinating, and you kind of hate him, but then you feel like maybe there's more there. Arsance is like, I don't know, he's a guy, Kris and I have talked, he's a guy you wish you could go back in time and like spend a weekend with, like he'd be, I think, a great dinner guest, right? I mean, you probably would drink all the wine, but okay. Anyway, I just wanted to throw that out. There's a few more great questions. There's one, as we're still talking about the parallels between 1719 and 2019. Let me just throw this question out at you, Kris. And this Alfonso Roca is saying, if you read about the writings about COVID-19, there will surely be certain trends and themes that will emerge. People will look back and see that. And maybe many of those general themes concerned people during the time period of your book. In other words, he's curious to hear about whether there was any significant thing that was absent. Like, as you were working on the project, was there anything that we might consider important today that was largely missing from the accounts you studied?
Well, that's a tough one. I'll try to be brief here. I don't want to monopolize the floor, but of course there are things that, based on our different understanding of public health and the movement of disease, our understanding of pathogens and how to counteract them. I didn't expect social distancing. There's a time when Arsan says, we were going to all pack into a church for a sermon and we decided it wasn't a good idea. And that's the only time he suggests social distancing. He doesn't, he talks about elites sort of hanging out in their houses and not going out, but it's not clear how they understand disease would be transferred. But he says, this sickness was so bad, you could get it just by looking at a sick person. It was that contagious. So there's this kind of ambivalence about contagion and how it functioned. And so he's never terribly explicit about it, but he does list the symptoms. And this is a disease that gives you 5 days. As soon as symptoms appear, you will get a very high fever, then you'll have a day off, and then you'll get a super high fever and your nose and mouth you'll be bleeding from the nose and mouth, and then you'll get a little bit of a rest, and then your chest will fill up and you're gone. And it's just about, you barely have time to confess. And so it makes COVID-19 look pretty tame by comparison, even at its worst. And so I think they're hard to compare, in part because of that. This is a sickness that sweeps through. It has various waves, and it's just crushing. It really is. It depopulates whole areas of the countryside. It really, throws the economy out of whack at a level that, we might complain about supply chains, but not about deserted, stretches of America or something. So it's pretty hard to make a really good comparison.
Thank you. Yeah, I think ambivalence about contagion and what we're supposed to do is definitely a part of what's going on now as well, right? So in theory, we have 1 minute left. If the three of you participants okay with staying on for another few more minutes? I have nods. Okay, wonderful. There are a few more questions. I know you can see them, but let's switch to the question about translation theory and method, because you've all sort of alluded a little bit to that. The question is specifically, what translation theory or methodology might you have drawn upon? Stunning silence.
Well, I can start if nobody's volunteering. I didn't have much of a theory, I have to admit. The main thing, the problem with documents of Lamport, most of them, is that they're not only very, very written in a very confused and very intense way, but also their oral statements that were transcribed by the Inquisition itself. It's not a book, it's not a worked text that you have the benefit of someone having worked on it before. In this case, it's sentences that go for 3 pages and packed with theoretical, theological, and anger intensity that makes it really very difficult. So the first thing was to try to understand what he means, to be very precise, and then to put commas and points and somewhere to make it more readable. And then, of course, to translate it to English, because I had transcribed them when they were in Spanish to Spanish, but the transcription was very hard. And then to go to English and to try to understand many words that come really from the 17th century was very difficult, but not much theory, I'm afraid.
Well, let me address that too. My goal was clearly to create a readable translation in a colloquial English, more or less an understandable translation, but at the same time to preserve a lot of the original flavor of the text. That was difficult, of course, because as Andrea mentioned, some of my sentences ran over pages also, and you cannot possibly render that in English, and nor is it desirable. So I was chopping up a lot of sentences, but ultimately I made sure that I was parsing every sentence, and I was essentially analyzing for pieces of information that were contained in each word, and I made sure that was actually considered in my translation. So I left, I feel I really looked at each linguistic element in original text and made sure that was reflected somehow in the translation, maybe not exactly in the same way. But there's some interesting idiosyncratic elements in the original text. For instance, Federmann uses often synonyms, one in German, one in Spanish, like for instance, village and pueblo, or village or pueblo. And he does that very, very frequently. And I decided to leave that in. That's actually an interesting strategy that comes out of the late Roman legal tradition, to add precision to language, and to add a sense of literacy and and also particularly if it's a bilingual version, it is a way of showing competence and of linguistic competence, both in Latin and in a vernacular, or in Federmann's case, in Spanish and in German. So I decided to preserve that because that was an important element in the text. So I tried to maintain as many of these very unique features of the text while still maintaining readability. So sometimes there were a lot of compromises that had to be made, but I think the result actually gives a relatively good idea of what the text reads like.
Do you want to say something, Kris?
Well, I'll just add or really echo my co-authors in saying that it's a very delicate task trying to render a voice from hundreds of years ago, written for a different kind of audience or for no audience at all, into something intelligible without really changing it. I'm sure Arsance's voice is not quite what he would have intended as I render it, but I did my best. I think I agree with both Andrea and Peter that when you get immersed in these texts long enough, you start to feel, okay, I think I know what they're trying to say, or I think I know how to make that intelligible without losing the flavor or losing that voice. But it's always hard. And I think what it makes Arsance a little easier is that he's a great storyteller, and he thought that he was going to be published, and he wasn't. So he was writing, this is his final draft, like submitted to the publisher, and Latin American Originals editor Matthew Restall said, "It's too long." It's like, what do you mean it's too long? It's 1,000,000 words long. It literally is. Arsance's full account is 1,000,000 words. So no wonder he couldn't find a publisher. And yet he's pretty clear. He thinks in terms of the caso, or the exemplary story. And so when he describes this particular event as a major watershed event in the history of his hometown, he boxes it out pretty carefully and gives you something to work with. So although this is an extract from a much, much, much larger work, it does have a kind of standalone quality thanks to the author.
There's still a couple of questions, and as we're already 6 minutes over, we don't really have time for both of them. One of them, Kris, you can see question from Diane Shelton about responding to your comment about the rich self-isolate and the poor die in droves. Maybe let's make sure that you can get a reply to that separately, Kris. I know that is answered in your book as well. Let's end with the other question that came in earlier, because it's a nice, short, simple question to end with. And I love this. Question is, how long did the process take from start to finish? That's you guys.
Well, let me start. I mean, the translation of the text, it's a couple year project. In 2018, I spent about 4 months. I had a research grant, so I had some time off. I spent about 4 months translating the text, and then that was the first translation. And then I did 2 revisions. The second one took 6 weeks. The third one took at least 3 weeks. And then writing the introduction, and then of course the whole editorial process. You know, like everybody else had to short my text also. So that's it's kind of in stages. Particularly, I think in a translation like mine, working in stages worked really well to kind of do the translation, let it sit for a few months, and come back and see with fresh eyes. And all of a sudden, so you have to kind of do it in layers. Otherwise you can't get through. So it was a 2-year project overall.
Andrea, you did yours in layers as well, didn't you?
I did it in layers, and it's like 8 years, but it wasn't continuous. But what I was thinking now is that it went little by little in terms of what to do with the originals. We have thousands of pages, and so you get drowned at first, simply drowned, and then it's very hard to find pieces like that stand as themselves, as you said, Kris. And so that was, and also to understand the importance of the documents. It's because nobody published them before you. I had like doubts of their meaning, of their importance. It was little by little that I went further and further. And I have more documents published on Lamport, which I didn't find their way in the book because they're very long. For example, the conversations with the Jews themselves in prison, they're all transcribed. They're in an incredible document. That's just an example. But it was very hard to know what to put, what not, and what to do with the material. It came by layers, but also it grew by itself. It wasn't self-evident from the start. That's what I'm trying to say.
Well, I mean, those 2 answers are so interesting. When you think of Kris and I had a conversation about this a couple of months into the pandemic, and he worked really quickly because we didn't know how long this wretched thing was going to last. We thought it would be over sooner, and we didn't want it to be over. And then everyone go, was this like a book about the pandemic? We're over that. That's done with. So little did we know, you needn't actually have worked quite so fast. I mean, your answer to the question is you did it in like a year and a half, but actually you were doing it in layers too, right? Because you were working on the text going way back.
Yeah, it's sort of, like I say, it was a mercenary project in that I wanted something that I could present to my students quickly as a module that would be relevant. And it turned out there was more to the story. And it seemed like by piecing these different narratives together with one core, that it would give us something to talk about. Again, not just to compare straight, this is what's happening today, this is what happened then, but how did people think of this differently even then? And how can we know? How can we understand? And if there were medical opinions, what were they? And so I ended up just getting lucky, frankly, and talking to a lot of different people whose work I knew people who were working on Buenos Aires at this period, and Rio de Janeiro. So I would write them these emails like, I've got this pandemic, and I'm wondering if you have evidence of it passing through Montevideo or if it's only in Buenos Aires. I think I've got Buenos Aires, but not Rio de Janeiro. It doesn't show up in Rio. And there's a simultaneous plague epidemic in Marseille in 1720. So I was writing to people about that. It's like, what's the best thing I can read on that? So it was really a lot of fun to explore it and make comparisons. But yeah, it was pretty much trying to keep busy in the pandemic when you can't go anywhere.
Thank you so much. And we're now a full 11 minutes over time, so we're definitely out of time. And I want to thank all three of you authors for coming and joining us. Obviously, thank you so much for the books. I'm incredibly proud of the three of them as an addition to the series. They really are absolutely fascinating, and they're great examples of how much skill and time and talent is involved in creating books like this. So thank you. And thank you to all of those of you who tuned in and who stuck it through even going over time. As I said earlier, attendees will receive a follow-up with links to all 4 books and a discount code of 40% off. Has to be absolutely irresistible. And if you want to know more about Penn State Press's virtual events, as well as all their wonderful books, please visit psupress.org. And you can follow the press on Twitter and Facebook and TikTok. Okay, I made the TikTok bit up, but it's on Twitter and Facebook. Right. Thank you so much. And I'm going to leave it to Kate now to close out everything. But
thank you very much.
Nice to see all of you and to hear about everything. Thank you.
Thank you.